Hey YouTube, it's Jordan with Studio GBK, and this week I take a slab of Claro Walnut and turn it into a shiny live edge mirror that looks kind of like something you might see in a rich person's house, but I'll let you all be the judge of that. I did cut my hand, but other than that, it went pretty smooth. So I started off with this 10-foot slab of Claro Walnut that I got from my guy Tony Sheriff, and I actually bought three of them, but this is the one that I decided to start working with. So the first thing I did was take them all to my guy at Ponderosa Millworks to get them all planed. This was just to remove the cup that was in it and get everything as flat as I possibly could. So once the wood was all flattened out, I began to debark it, which is basically just a process of removing all of the softwood around the perimeter of the slab. And when you're going to create anything, you always want to remove this bark because it's basically the weakest part. And I guess some people keep it on there that don't know what they're doing, but I highly recommend removing it because why would you keep the weakest part of the wood when you're trying to create a strong piece? And you don't want anything flaking off after you've applied the finish. And, you also want to remove any of the softwood that's not around the perimeter. Sometimes in the center, there are little soft spots or wormholes, things like that. And you just want to get in there with a hook tool or something sharp and scrape all of that out so that you have just the hardwood. It was a lot of fun, very satisfying process, almost like popping a pimple or something. So once I debarked the whole thing, it was time to start breaking it down to a size that I needed and get ready to create a book match. So I have one mirror that's about 66 inches and another that was like 50 something. So I just kind of cut the slab somewhere in the middle so I would have some playroom for both mirrors that I'm attempting to make here. So I cut one side at 67 inches and another side a little bit less so that I would have some wiggle room there. And once I finished doing that, it was time to split the wood perfectly down the middle because that's what's required to make a book match. So I needed to split these two slabs that I have perfectly down the middle. I fully understand that the textbook way to split a slab perfectly down the middle is using a industrial bandsaw or one of those chainsaw mills, but I obviously don't have one of those. Here at my small shop, I'm just getting started, so I kind of wrestle with the idea of how to go about this. So I decided to use my table saw, and basically my idea was that I would do a shallow pass on each side, obviously measure it perfectly to the middle, and then line up the blade and run it through with the blade about an inch up, and then slowly raise it all the way higher. And as you can see here, I have some 2x4s that I connected going up a little bit higher. And it basically was to give it support, give the slab support so that I didn't have as much room to go to the left or right and cause the blade to bind. So this was a pretty foolproof plan. It was actually going pretty smooth until all of a sudden the blade started wobbling uncontrollably, just shaking the whole saw. And what ended up happening was the belt had got too hot or it was too old. I don't know, maybe both, and it came undone. It started to fray there, as you can see, and that's what was causing the blade to shake. So a little bit disappointing there because I thought that I had a foolproof plan, but things don't always go as you expect. So from there, I ran to Home Depot. I wasn't going to let that stop me, and I bought a Sawzall, which to people that are not doing this kind of thing, it's actually called a reciprocating saw. But anyone that actually uses a Sawzall calls it a Sawzall, and people that don't use a Sawzall call it a reciprocating saw. So I went to Home Depot, I got the Sawzall, and I bought two blades for it. And I basically just came back and continued on the line that I had started with the table saw. And if you're doing this, you just want to make sure that you switch out the blades periodically because they will get really, really hot. And one of them got hot enough on me that it ended up just breaking off so that the blade is no longer usable. But long story short, I was able to get through that slab pretty smoothly. And then I wanted to do the other half with no table saw. I just started ripping it. Um, I just went in on it and I actually got the other half all the way down the middle. Really, really no issues with it. When you're doing this, you just want to make sure that you watch the blade and make sure that you're coming perfectly down the middle and that you're not going to the left or the right, and you just slowly make your way down the slab. Um, it actually came out smoother than I expected for using a Sawzall, which you're really not supposed to use. But when it was done, it looked like this. The inside was a bit wavy because there's just going to be natural human error where the blade goes a little bit to the left or the right, but I have a solution for that. So once I got the slabs all split down the middle, I was pretty satisfied with how it came out. They're not perfect, but good enough for me to work with. And from there, it was time to seal the slab. And the process of sealing a slab is basically when you mix up some epoxy and resin, whatever you want to call it. Um, but you mix up the resin and you basically spread it across the entire slab so that you're filling in all of the little cracks and holes that occur naturally in the wood. And this will add stability to the wood and stop those cracks from continuing to split further. And the epoxy also penetrates the wood, making it stronger and waterproof and less vulnerable to outside temperature changes and things of that nature that would regularly damage the wood. And it also makes the wood much harder to scratch. So once this epoxy is penetrated, it's just much more of a solid piece than when it's in its original form. So I sealed all of the slabs basically and flipped them over and started sealing the other side. I think the seal is most important on the face, but I just want to do the other side too because you can never seal them too much. When I'm done, I set them on these 2x4s that I have taped with some tuck tape that you would use like in a epoxy mold. And this is just so that when I come back to remove these slabs, they will peel off easily without getting stuck to that wood. If you don't do this, they will bond to the wood and become one forever. So I will leave those for about 24 hours. Really, it's done in less than that. And from there, it was time to sand off and remove all of the drips and just basically get the wood nice and smooth and ready for me to put the mirror inside of it. So, in order to do this, I start with an 80 grit because it's a little bit more abrasive. Actually, I think I started with a 40. I started with a 40 and I moved up to 80, and you're just going to run circles all over the epoxy and make sure that you erase it so that you're down to just the wood. And I know some people would be like, well, doesn't that remove the seal? No, the seal has already penetrated the wood. It's already penetrated the holes and the cracks. So that's in there. You're just trying to make it look clean now. So you're running through there. Don't leave any epoxy on it because you want it to look as nice as possible when you apply your finish. And any epoxy there will ruin that. Um, some of these little knots and twists around the edge are kind of harder to get with my sander because it's very wide. And in those areas, you just get in there by using sandpaper in your hand and you just kind of get in those smaller grooves when you have to. But obviously, the majority of it is done with the sander. And at this point, I'm almost ready to set my mirror, but the back of the slab, which is the opposite side of the face, where I was cutting them, to make the book match, it's a little bit wavy, and that could present a problem when setting a mirror because I want the mirror to be as flat as possible. So I decided to come through with my hand planer and basically just make these as flat as possible. You'll see here that I used one of these clamps from Rockler Wood Co. to basically drill a hole in the table wherever you decide, and then I come up with the little thread screw there, and you just clamp it down and make it tight. Um, yeah, right there, I took a bevel square to the face. Don't know if you guys saw that, but this is definitely a contact sport. This whole woodworking thing, got to be built to last, man. Um, so I've always planed my slabs with routers or, commercial wide belt sanders, things of that nature. But this is actually my first time using a hand planer, and I really wasn't sure how it was going to go. It's a tool that I've actually had for years, but I've just never used it because it's kind of like, I don't know, scared of using new tools, I guess. But it actually went super smooth. I give this Bosch hand planer a 10 out of 10. super user friendly, super easy to use, and it didn't give me any trouble, and it got the job done. Um, Once I finished planing there, I used my sander again with the 40 to 80 grit just to kind of smooth everything out and make it as flat as possible. And once I finish doing that, I'm going to come back to the face, and you'll notice that although it's sealed with the epoxy to fill the majority of the cracks, there's still some little hairline cracks and micro pits and things of that nature. So when you're going for a perfect finish on the face, you're going to want to fill all of those in. So I decided to use CA glue, which is basically a super glue, kind of like epoxy though, with a spray-on activator. And I just go around to all these holes and fill them in with the glue. And then you spray the activator, and it causes it to harden within probably about 30 seconds or less. And if you were to put your finger on it, you feel it get really hot. So it's definitely got that epoxy effect to it. And I just want to remind you guys, this is not a deep pour epoxy. This is really not meant to go beyond a 16th of an inch. And if it does go beyond a 16th of an inch and it goes into an eighth or something like that, it'll just kind of, it'll be hard on the surface but wet underneath. As in, if you poke it with something sharp, you will see a, it'll be solid on the surface, but it will have this wet epoxy down underneath. So if you're going to go beyond an eighth of an inch, you really want to just do a 16th at a time. So what that would mean is, put a little bit, spray on the activator, add another layer, 16th, spray on the activator. And as you're spraying on its activator, you're obviously giving it time to, set and get hard and all that. And then I sanded off, and this process actually took me a while. I thought it was going to go much faster than it did. And next thing I know, I'd been there for hours and hours, continuing to find new holes and new areas that I hadn't taken care of. So I got really carried away, but nothing wrong with that because I'm going for a perfect product here. After that was done, I'm ready to cut these slabs to size. And I'm sure you may be wondering, how do you cut a live edge perfectly straight? So basically, I know that the edge of my table is straight, so I'm going to use that as a reference point. And I take both slabs and lined them up with the edge of the table. And I basically clamped these 2x4s to the edge so that I can take my square and have it perfectly to the edge of the table, which I know is straight. And from there, I'm lining up both of the slabs, and I basically take my straight edge and go perfectly across the face of these slabs. And I make a line. And this line is obviously going to look crooked across the slabs, but it's actually a perfectly straight line because it's in accordance with the edge of my table going at a 90-degree angle. So from there, I'm going to take the slabs over to the chop saw and chop perfectly along that line on both of the slabs. And once I finish doing that, I'm going to put the slabs back on the table and get them perfectly aligned so that I can use that same square, putting it to the edge of the table to make sure that it's going straight and making sure that the edges of the slabs are perfectly adhering to that. And I'm going to use these little clamps to hold them down so I know that they don't move anywhere. That's super important for the next part of this process. And once I've lined up the slabs perfectly, I'm going to take my tape measure and measure off of that edge, that perfectly straight edge. And I'm going to go up the slab 66 inches. I'm obviously doing 66 inches because that's how big the mirror is. And if your mirror is, say, 66 inches, you might want to give a little bit extra, like 66 and a 16th, maybe a little less, because you want to have some room for play, or, in case you make some sort of a mistake. You're not a perfect woodworker. I'm definitely not a perfect woodworker. So I'm going to make multiple marks at 66 inches across the edge. And I'm making multiple marks so that I can take a straight edge and run a line through all of them and have an idea of where I'm going to cut on this other side. And given the fact that the other side is clamped, down, it's perfectly straight. If I'm measuring off that side at 66 and I keep doing that, theoretically, I should have a straight line on this side. So once I make all these marks, I'm going to take a straight edge and I'm going to connect these as straight as possible. And this can be a little bit confusing because sometimes one mark doesn't really line up with the other, but you just want to make sure it's as close to the multiple marks that you've made as possible. And at this point, I'm going to come back and check with my tape measure. And at that point, I started getting a little bit scared because part of the line was on 66, part of the line wasn't on 66. So I'm like, what am I going to do here? Because once this is cut, and there ain't no going back. So what I ended up doing was just taking the whole mirror and just putting it on top, lining up the mirror with the side that I knew was straight, and then coming to the bottom and making a line. And the line that I got with that was actually very close to the lines that I made when I was measuring with the 66, but it was not identical. And I realized that if I did cut where I thought it was going to be, it was going to be off. So as you see here, um, my original line that I had made is the one at the bottom, and the line that I got when I actually dry fit the mirror onto there, on that one side, it's, maybe an eighth or so off. The other side's even worse, closer to a quarter. So once I do that, I go and I make that cut right there on the line that I know is correct because I put the mirror up to it. And once I finish cutting these slabs to size, I'm basically going to come back and sand these down to the final smoothness that I'm looking for. And as you can see here, I go through with a pencil and lightly mark the wood, and that's just so that as I'm sanding, I don't stay in one place too long. And once the sander erases the pencil marks, I know those areas are finished. And I start off with 100 grit, then I move up to 120, then 150, 180, 220, and then I finish with 320. It's best not to skip through the grits. Don't ask me why. I just know that you're not supposed to and that it'll mess it up. Once the sanding process is complete, I'm going to go through and oil and finish the slab. Well, on this one, I used walrus oil, and I actually didn't have any shop rags on me. So that's an old beanie that you see me using there to rub it all in. And you really don't have to put oil on the back of the slab, but you want to make sure that you get it on the inside edge where the mirror is going to connect, or else you will see a reflection that is not stained, which looks really bad. So once the stain is done, I flip these over and I'm going to prime the side that I'll be sticking the mirror to. And all this primer does is make sure that the mirror and the silicone bond to the wood as strong as they possibly can. And that primer should dry within a couple minutes. And while that's drying, I put the mirror back on the table and line the slabs up exactly where I want them to be. Obviously making sure that the top and bottom are perfectly square. I'm doing this so that I can mark exactly where the edge of my mirror will be before I attach the strips of wood that will help hold it in place on both sides. Once I make those perfect marks, I take these strips of wood and line them up as perfectly as I can with the edge of the lines that I just made. And the majority of these strips will be hidden by the slab, but any part that hangs over, you just want to mark where that overhang is so that extra can be sanded off, and that way you won't see it from the front of the mirror. And the first one I sanded, but it took so long, I actually did the rest of them with a jigsaw to save time. And once these strips are prepared, I'm going to blow off any excess dust with my air compressor and use a wood glue or liquid nails to glue them to the back of the slab. And you want to make sure that you're following that line perfectly straight because the strips are part of what's going to hold the mirror in place. So I apply the wood glue and then I use clamps to clamp them down as tight as possible. And I just kind of want that glue to ooze out of the sides. And you're going to leave those clamps on there until it fully dries and make sure that it doesn't come off of the line while you're clamping it because sometimes that happens. Once those clamps are on, I come back with some sort of scraper and clean up that excess glue that's coming out of the sides. And I was actually using flat blades for this because I didn't know where my scraper was. And that's how I cut my hand open, by putting a blade where it didn't belong. No stitches, but yeah, it was a mess. And once I got those wood strips right where I want them, I'm going to take the slabs and space them about as far apart as the mirror is going to be. And I did that by measuring the width and putting them just a little further open so it has room to slide in. And from there, I'm going to come back with silicone and run it all through that area on the back of the slab where I'm going to set the mirror. After that, I set the mirror and just make sure that it's nice and tight on the edges and that the top and bottom are square. And once I get that mirror right where I want it, I'm going to come back with the clamps and clamp the mirror and the wood to make sure it's pressing down on that silicone as tight as I possibly can. And these clamps are going to hold it in place. So I'm going to leave it there with the clamps on it for about 24 hours to allow it to cure. And after that, I'm going to come back and remove all those clamps, and it should stay right where it is. And from there, I'm ready to put my backing on it. I used a thin piece of particle board that you can buy at Home Depot. It's about 3/16 thick, and I just measure out the size that I need to cover the back perfectly, and I cut it with a skill saw. But you can really use a jigsaw or even a table saw or whatever you have. You can see I clamped the straight edge on there so that it is straight with both lines, and I make marks on both sides and I cut it. I was like a quarter off for some reason and had to come back and remove that little sliver that you see me cutting there. But once I have that board to size, I just line it up with the edges and make sure that it's going to fit on the back exactly as I want. And from there, I will remove the backing and spray it off with the air compressor to prevent any dust from interfering with the silicone that I'm putting on the back. And then I just run some beads of silicone and place that backing piece right where I want it. And I go across it with my fist to apply pressure and make it as flat as possible with the back of the mirror, just pressing down on any of the high points. From there, I'm ready to screw this back piece into place. I'm going to lay out my holes evenly on both sides, coming in with the small drill bit to pre-drill them and a larger one to countersink them. And I like the countersink so that the screws are flush with the back of it and not sticking out like they're not supposed to be. Even though it's the back, it still doesn't hurt to make it look nice. I used this Varathane wood stain to add some natural color to the sides of these wood strips so they don't have that 2x4 color. And I went with dark walnut because it seemed like the color that would match best with the face, and it actually turned out pretty good. So I put some tape down so it wouldn't spread to the back, and when I peeled the tape it came up pretty decent. After that, I attached the hooks and wire that this mirror is going to hang off of. And this basically gives me the ability to hang it to the wall or have it freestanding on the floor, whichever the client prefers. And when I'm done attaching the hooks and the wire, it'll look a little something like this. And you just want to make sure that you tie the wire tight and that the wire is rated to hold the weight of the mirror that you made. When it was all said and done, it came out looking really good, and I was satisfied with the final product. Let me know what you guys think, and if your thumbs are working, hit that like and subscribe button. I actually bled for this video, so show me some love. Have a great day, everyone, and I'll see you on the next one.